Dear colleagues, we continue our work. The topic of the next event, monitoring mission on human rights of UN in Ukraine, is presenting the 17th report on human rights situation in Ukraine. Fiona, Frazer, head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, will take the floor.
Good morning to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this morning to join us for the launch of the 17th report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the human rights situation in Ukraine. As you know, this report covers the 3-month period between the 16th of November 2016 and the 15th of February 2017. During this period, we saw 2 particular sharp escalations in hostilities in the east, in November and December of last year, and in late January and early February of this year. With each spike in fighting, people are deprived of their basic human rights: the right to life, physical integrity, the freedom of movement, access to medical care and education. Their experiences are real and painful, and remind us that this conflict has a human face. The face of this conflict is that of an elderly man who has been hiding every night in a basement in Petrovsky district of Donetsk to seek shelter from nearby shelling. Sleeping, eating, going to the bathroom in damp, cold, and degrading conditions. The conflict also has the face of a woman who works at the Donetsk filtration station in Avdiivka, but lives in Krutabalka neighborhood in Yasenovata, her life cut in two by the contact line. The findings of the report are based on interviews with 205 people conducted throughout Ukraine who have suffered human rights violations or witnessed them. This is the daily work over the past 3 months of our teams based in Kiev, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Odessa, Kramatorsk, and across the contact line in Donetsk. We are often asked, though, so you interview people, and what is next? We have ensured that in 85% of cases we carry out follow-up action to enable human rights protection. We do this through monitoring trials, visiting detainees, referring cases to state institutions, humanitarian organizations, and NGOs for human rights protection. We support the people who, for 3 years, have suffered from violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Between the 16th of November 2016 and the 15th of February 2017, we recorded 130 conflict-related civilian casualties in Ukraine, 23 deaths and 107 injured. Shelling, including from multiple launch rocket systems, caused 65% of these civilian casualties. Even though this is a decrease compared with the last reporting 3-month period, it is much higher than the same period last year. So what does this mean? This tells us that parties to the conflict still need to do much more to protect civilians. They have to do what they promised in Minsk, to strictly adhere to the ceasefire and withdraw their weapons and fighters from the contact line. The conflict has cost many lives and continues to impact on countless others. In total, we have recorded 33,146 casualties, among these civilians, Ukrainian armed forces, and members of the armed groups. I would like to share with you some observations that I made a few weeks ago while visiting both sides of the contact line. In Donetsk, I walked around the market near the railway station and spoke to people. They had suffered from shelling in late January and early February. Schools and hospitals were damaged. In some places, people did not have water and electricity. People told me, we want this to stop. I then went to Avdiivka and spoke to people there. They too told me that they suffered a lot, and in fact they had suffered in the same way with the same things as people in Donetsk. And they also told me, we want it to stop. So in the space of 24 hours, I heard the exact same sentiments from people divided by an artificial line. That is the nature of indiscriminate shelling. It does not discriminate. We have to remember that the contact line is an arbitrary boundary and not a border. Yet, this artificial arbitrary line has very real consequences. In Donetsk, I saw that divisions are growing as the armed group-controlled territory becomes more isolated. Disproportionate restrictions on freedom of movement across the contact line severely affect an average of 23,000 people per day and more than 700,000 people per month. We must recognize that such restrictions deepen the divide between communities, and they may hamper efforts to establish lasting peace in Ukraine. While welcoming the government's efforts to improve access to social and economic rights across Ukraine, including for internally displaced persons, the report recalls that at least 160,000 pensioners residing in the territory controlled by armed groups have been deprived of their pensions since November 2014. The report again urges the government to ensure that everyone has access to their social entitlements. We recommend the government to de-link access to pensions from IDP registration. Detention of people continues on both sides of the contact line. We have access to government prisons and pre-trial detention facilities, but have yet to receive full and unfettered access on armed group-controlled territory. The self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and self-proclaimed Lugansk People's Republic continue to detain an unknown number of people, raising worries that they may be subject to torture and ill treatment, as well as sexual violence. We have observed a low level of trust in the judiciary in Ukraine. This mostly results from frequent violations of due process, including undue delays and interference with the judicial process. This is why we keep on insisting on the importance of finalizing the judicial reform. Accountability is critical and depends on the functioning of an independent and robust judiciary. We note that the General Prosecutor's Office and Military Prosecutor's Office have taken some important steps towards investigating conflict-related violations and abuses, including violations by the Ukrainian armed forces and abuses by the armed groups in eastern Ukraine. It is critical that these investigations are effective, conducted without delay, and in line with international human rights standards. We also continue to monitor the investigation and judicial proceedings in the high-profile cases of violence related to riots and public disturbances, in particular the killings at Maidan and those during the violence in Odessa on the 2nd of May 2014. Our work on Crimea has been furthered by the UN General Assembly Resolution 71205, adopted on the 19th of December 2016. The resolution recognizes Crimea as under the temporary occupation of the Russian Federation. In this report, we express our concern at ongoing serious human rights violations in Crimea, in particular, the treatment of detainees. The authorities in Crimea extract confessions from detained persons through torture and ill treatment. They continue to transfer detainees to the Russian Federation, where we have documented cases of denial of medical care and the death of at least one detainee. The new pattern we observe during this period is the interference in the professional activities of defence lawyers in prominent human rights cases. Against this backdrop, we welcome the ongoing dialogue between the ombudspersons of Ukraine and the Russian Federation to facilitate the voluntary transfer of Ukrainian prisoners held in Crimea to penitentiary institutions in mainland Ukraine and encourage this further cooperation. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to what we have accomplished over the last 3 months, demonstrating our ongoing commitment to assist the government of Ukraine in fulfilling its human rights obligations. First, we have advocated with the government to combat impunity, particularly for conflict-related violations, including sexual violence. This was particularly pointed out in our report on the 16th of February 2017, which we published on conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. It included actionable recommendations for improving investigations of and response to cases of sexual violence. Second, we continue to engage on the results of the first year of the implementation of the National Human Rights Action Plan. It entails improvements to the judicial system. In January and February, we conducted trainings on investigating and documenting torture for around 400 newly recruited regional prosecutors. Third, we have provided advisory services on the draft legislation on missing persons to lawmakers, as well as other draft legislation. Fourth, during the parliamentary committee hearings on the draft law on temporarily occupied territory, we recalled the obligation of the government to ensure that a humanitarian minimum of essential supplies and services for the civilian population in the territory controlled by armed groups is not hindered. We also reminded lawmakers of the government's responsibility to protect the rights of the population concerned. We are hopeful that the draft law is being revised in line with these obligations and responsibilities. These are some examples of how we work with the government, and we will continue to support and advise the government in its role to guarantee the promotion and protection of human rights for everyone in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fiona. Дякую, пані Фіона. У нас є кілька запитань. Будь ласка, представляйте.
We have several questions. Please introduce yourselves.
Put on the headphone.
Директор института.
Okay. Director, чекайте. The director of the Legal Policy and Social Protection, Elena Berezhna. The 3rd of June, here was Ivan Shimanovich, your boss. It was 3rd of June last year. And I suggested to him in your presence to consider the issue of initiating in front of the Security Service of UN to initiate the criminal case on the crimes committed by the state of Ukraine. He stated, and that was registered, that we will consider that, and via you we will inform about the decision passed. 9 months have passed, so what was the decision made? That's first. And second, taking into account the fact that now at the International UN Court, the issue of Ukraine is being considered. Are you planning as a monitoring mission to send the facts there on violating 2 conventions by the state of Ukraine. You confirmed that there's discrimination of the people who reside on the territory of Donbass and who are not paid their social payments despite the decision of the court that our institute won back in 2015. And there was a report at the UN General Assembly session that Ukraine is not doing it. And also you gave facts that there is the support of Ukraine, of the support by Ukraine of the terrorists, and that's like shellings of the filtration station, and this has the signs of terrorism. I'm planning to submit these materials to the Hague Court as the violation of 2 conventions by the state of Ukraine. Thank you for the answer.
Very much for the questions. The information that we document is available obviously in our public reports, the quarterly public reports that we issue, as well as the past 2 thematic reports that we have also publicized, one on accountability and one on conflict-related sexual violence. This information is available to everybody, for use by everybody, and so if it should be used within a judicial proceedings, that's up for members of those proceedings to decide. And I would not want to comment on ongoing case that is before an international court.
Дякую, пані Фіоно. Колеги, чи є ще запитання?
Thank you. Any other questions?
Я задам українською.
This will be in Ukrainian. The Institute of Liberalism. Do you have any difficulties in documenting the crimes on temporary occupied territories?
So for the question, we work on territory that's under the control of the armed groups in the same way that we work in government-controlled areas. We have a set methodology, as I've already outlined. Our teams on the ground interview on a daily basis victims and witnesses of both international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and then we seek to verify that information through different means depending on the particular issue. And we are able to undertake such work on both sides of the contact line, and we are able to move around, access to the locations that we want to access, and we are also able to speak to people that we wish to speak to.
Дякую, пані Фіоно. Колеги, чи є
Thank you. Any other questions? Please introduce yourself. Igor Filipenko, Information Agency Nation. Was there monitoring of such a problem as violation of rights of children, violence in the family? Is that really very important for Ukraine? Are you working on this topic?
So we have looked at the situation with regards to the rights of the child, particularly when it comes to, certain issues. We focused on the conflict, so within that, and you'll see this also in your report, information on the impact on children, for example, when it comes to recording casualties of children, boys and girls, whether they're killed and also injured. So there's segregated data on that. And we have also worked with other partners on the impact of the conflict with regards to education and so forth, and how children are able to access that. And that's also identified in the report. We have one very particular case, for example, of where we've identified that in a village very close to the contact line, you actually see children having to cross the contact line in order to go to school. That's an example of something we've been working with partners and documenting the consequences of the division caused by the conflict and the contact line. And we work with, again, I'd say our other partners, whether it be in the UN system or with NGOs or with the Ombudsman institution, in identifying the impact of the situation, both with regard to the conflict, but more broadly in Ukraine, on human rights protection for children. And often we actually refer cases to partners who have a bit more focus on this issue, which I'm sure you can understand why. Thank you.
Дякую, колеги. Чи є ще запитання?
Any other questions?
At this point, the press conference is finished. Thank you for coming and looking forward to seeing you here in the closest future.